Welcome everyone to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I'm Sherry Mealand, a student here at the UW-Madison School of Social Work, and happy to be here for the breakout presentation, Centering Justice and Lived Experience as an Anti-Racist Framework, the Role of Certified Peer Specialists in Behavioral Health Reform. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Before we start today, I would like to share our university's land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tijo since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Thank you all. Just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. Few more things before we introduce the speakers today. To access this presentation on Zoom, you were required to provide your name and email. This allows us to log our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted, but we have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will not be able to get to all questions that are submitted. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters, Carmella Glenn, Tim Saubers, Tara Wilhelmi, Dani Rischall, and Alicia Clark. Carmella Glenn is from Madison, Wisconsin. She has worked in the criminal justice field for over 15 years and has a degree in culinary arts and criminal justice. She is a certified peer specialist trainer, and in her day job, she's the program coordinator for Just Bakery, where both of her passions are fulfilled, food and criminal justice. Just Bakery is a 3-month employment training program for people with barriers to employment, which include people who are justice involved, struggle with mental health and/or substance use disorder, and homelessness. Tim Saubers serves as the Peer Specialist Program Manager for the Wisconsin Peer Specialist Employment Initiative. He became a certified peer specialist in 2016 and has worked in direct support and supervisory roles. Additionally, Tim sits on 10 state and national committees and work groups. These work groups are dedicated to advancing the peer profession, reforming the mental health and substance use service systems, and the rights of people living with disabilities, among others. Tim continues the development of the professional peer workforce through expanding employment opportunities and community education. He centers the principles of equity and justice while moving not just to disrupt and reform systems, but to create new systems in their entirety. Tara Wilhelmi leads a grassroots community recovery and wellness organization, EOTO, Culturally Rooted. She is a certified peer specialist and state trainer of certified peer specialists, providing support to individuals navigating mental health, substance use, and trauma recovery. Driven by her passion for positive social change and thriving healthy communities of color, she enjoys acting as a connector and seed planter, working on several impactful collaborations throughout Wisconsin. As a certified peer specialist and lived experienced public speaker, Tara subscribes to a each one, teach one knowledge and skill sharing ideology that she believes is key to challenging systemic injustice. Dani Rischall is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked in the field of community health for over 15 years. Dani is currently the executive director of Chrysalis, Inc., a Madison nonprofit that promotes mental health recovery in our community by supporting work opportunities that encourage hope, healing, and wellness. Dani is a strong advocate for the role and expansion of certified peer specialists throughout behavioral health care. Alicia Clark has been a certified peer specialist in the state of Wisconsin since 2013. She currently works as a supervisor of certified peer specialists and is the co-leader with Tara Wilhelmi for the Dane County Peer Specialist Network. And now, finally, I'll pass it over to Alicia so our panelists can speak. Thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Sherry. Hi, I am Alicia Clark. I'm a person with lived experience with mental health and substance use challenge and a certified peer specialist. And I am going to help moderate the conversation we're having. I just want to thank, that we are being asked to be in this space. Peer specialists are, a movement that I'm really passionate about, and I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity to speak to all of you. And I also want to call out that, some of this discussion might be uncomfortable for you, or things that you haven't heard of, or things that are challenging to you. And I really want to encourage you to lean into that and talk with others to kind of debrief afterwards. So I'm just going to get started. And if you see me look over here, I have our little skeleton of a agenda over here. But I'm just going to talk about where have I come from? How did we get here? So I am a person that started out in human services, and I was really excited to be in the certified peer specialist movement that was happening. It started in 2010, but in 2013, I was certified, and it really just called to me based on my own lived experience. And through that, I got to learn a lot about other people's lived experience and be a part of a movement that was really around being a human with another human. So I'm really passionate about it. But we have some really fabulous speakers that I'm really excited to introduce you to. So I'm going to give it over to Carmella to intro, where have you come from and how did you get here?
Thank you, Alicia. So again, my name is Carmella Glenn, and where I came from is a upbringing and family who struggled around mental health and substance use. I grew up in a family with lots of violence and domestic violence. And so I started my early career around domestic violence and realized that, there's never one piece to a puzzle. And so doing just domestic violence wasn't enough. I needed to know what happened to people that were perpetrating domestic violence. And so I started working inside the prison system to work with men that were doing that. And so I come from just a lot of lived experience around mental health, substance use. How I got here was I have my mother was incarcerated, my father was incarcerated, my brother was incarcerated, my husband's been incarcerated. I have been in Dane County Jail before. I struggled with alcoholism and have been sober for 18 years now. And I knew that I fell in love with peer support and became a trainer 2 years ago and a certified peer specialist 3 years ago. Quickly knew I wanted to be part of the training and part of the movement and part of the Disruptors. So I will hand it over to, who's next? Alicia, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Carmella. To Tim.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Saubers. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I wanted to do a quick visual description for people who may be on the phone or who may have visual disabilities. I'm a very light-skinned Latino male. I'm wearing black glasses, I have black hair, and I'm wearing a white shawl collar cardigan. I'm also wearing a pin that says "Silence is the voice of complicity." I'm the peer specialist program manager, and I've been a certified peer specialist for 5 years this year. Most of my experience comes from providing peer support services in quote unquote crisis situations, what has been clinically defined to be a crisis, such as people having thoughts of suicide, experiencing self-harm, fleeing domestic violence, and providing support to them and supervising that team and then taking this position. I'm also a person with lived experience with both mental health and substance use. I choose not to engage in abstinence-based recovery, and I mention that because a large part of what I find invigorating and refreshing about the certified peer specialist workforce and movement is that it's really about pushing systems to examine the way that things have been done historically and to move in new directions. So recognizing that abstinence-based recovery from substance use isn't the only way forward is pivotal to being a certified peer specialist. And what I think is most exciting for me to be managing this program is being able to bring forward the collective voice of people with lived experiences to hold systems accountable and to really push for reform. I'm really excited to be on this panel today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Tim. And we will go over to Tara.
Hello, everyone. Glad that you were able to join us today. My name is Tara Wilhelmi. I also identify as a person with lived experience in mental health and substance use. I would also identify chronic trauma, especially racialized trauma, as being part of my lived experience and the support that I offer to the community. How did I get here? I jokingly said my mama when we were in the other space, but I am a kidder. But no, how I got here really, this is my third year of being a certified peer support specialist. My first year as being a state trainer. Similar to Carmella, as soon as I got into the movement, I knew I wanted to be part of growing, expanding, and really system interruption as a peer support specialist. So quickly got connected to Tim and started asking, how can I do more? And how can I be more involved? And where is the diversity in the workforce? Which throughout this panel, you'll hear is really a passion for me. I was invited to a private training that was funded through Focus Interruption, which is a grassroots organization here in Madison dedicated to interrupting violence, specifically gun violence. Gun violence has touched my life from my teenage life all the way to now I have a son who's incarcerated for homicide in another state. So that was really important to me to think about how could I use my lived experience and my connections to this community to try to stand in that space. Once I went through the training, I also then became interested in employment in some outpatient mental health clinics. And so I took a position with 2 Black-owned mental health facilities here in Madison. Myra McNear hired me at Anesis Therapy. And then I also had a position with Thomas and Associates. And so through that, I was able to really get a grasp of what it is to be a peer support specialist in a clinical setting. And from there this year, I've gone out and entrepreneurially really working to see how I can support other Black and BIPOC and folks with lived experience to take this path, to utilize peer support, not only as a pathway to recovery, but also advocacy, systems change, and a career. I'm looking forward to spending this time with all of you and getting this panel discussion going. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. And we'll end with Dani.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here, the panelists. Thanks to the School of Social Work for having us. My name is Dani Rischall, pronoun she, her, hers, and I come here with the background of being a social worker. I actually graduated from the UW-Madison School of Social Work for my bachelor's in social work. And prior to that, my first kind of experience in mental health was as a family member, as a niece, as a sister, as a daughter, grew up kind of in kind of providing support and being part of a family with a lot of mental health needs, and quickly had experiences in internships and field placements. I was really lucky. One of my first experiences was working in the clubhouse model here in Madison at Yahara House, and saw the value of really encouraging folks with lived experience to be in the driver's seat of their services, valuing that dignity, and was excited to explore that more. Had some work experience on an assertive community treatment team out east, working with the harm reduction model and Housing First. And that was where I first was introduced to the peer support model, with a peer specialist being part of our treatment team out there, and saw immediately the benefits of working alongside certified peer specialists. And fast forward the last almost 10 years, I've worked at Chrysalis, which is, as was mentioned earlier, an organization that focuses on supported employment and peer support. Half our staff are certified peer specialists, and again, have just seen the immense value of having certified peer specialists in behavioral health and see a huge need in expanding the movement. And I'm really excited to continue the conversation with this group here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Dani. And to start us off, I think it's a great idea to talk just about the basics of like, what is a certified peer specialist? So I'm going to hand it over to Tim to answer that question.
Thanks, Alicia. I also forgot to mention this earlier, but I tend to speak very quickly. And so if you need me to slow it down, feel free to put it into whatever space that you have to send that message along. You will not be the first person to ask me to slow down when I'm speaking. So a certified peer specialist in Wisconsin is a person with lived experience with mental health and or substance use who is in a place in their recovery where they feel they're able to share their story with others in a way that inspires hope and demonstrates that recovery is possible. Before we even move out of that first statement, what's really important is recognizing that with mental health and substance use lived experience, that encompasses a very wide range of experiences. You don't necessarily need to have had a diagnosis of any kind. You don't have to have engaged with the standard mental health and substance use service systems. You don't have to have engaged in treatment, taken meds, attended like a recovery program or meeting. You just have to be a person who is comfortable owning that label of a person with lived experience. We also don't ask people to define what that means. So for me, it means I do have several clinical diagnoses. For someone else, it might be that they experienced some form of trauma that to them was impactful enough to identify with that label. Wisconsin's very flexible with that definition, and we leave it up to each person individually to decide for themselves the meaning and impact of their own life experiences. So after being comfortable with that label, in order to actually become a certified peer specialist in Wisconsin, there is a 48-hour training that they need to take. It is right now being done online, but is usually done in person. We actually just recently launched a revised curriculum for the state, which I helped co-author, and it covers such things as like trauma-informed care, specific communication frameworks, spirituality and religion, various diagnoses, just so that they have information about it. But what's really centered in the peer specialist training is that person-centered care and the mutuality, empowerment, and self-determination of each person receiving services. So peer specialists aren't going to define for another person what their life should look like, what a meaningful life looks like to them, what recovery is, what a crisis is, what mental health or substance use means. It's all based on the person who's receiving services. So after taking the training, a person who would like to become a certified peer specialist needs to then pass the state certification exam. And once they've done that, they would be considered a certified peer specialist. That certification is backed by the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, and so it is regulated, it is maintained. There are continuing education requirements in order to maintain your certification. You need to recertify every 2 years, and they are considered a behavioral health professional. In addition, once you're a certified peer specialist, there are actual kind of guidelines that regulate the profession. It does have its own code of ethics, scope of practice, core competencies, some guiding documents, very similar to social workers and other behavioral health professionals that help provide guidance and oversight to the profession. I do think it's important to name that those documents are not rules that are set in stone. On top, at the beginning of each document, it specifically says these are guidelines, these are reference points. And so there is no kind of set way of this is exactly what a certified peer specialist is supposed to do in every single situation. There's a set of guidelines and ethical principles that we're expected to follow. Currently in Wisconsin, certified peer specialists work within the Comprehensive Community Services program. The majority of them do. That is where most of the funding is available. If you're going to provide billable services, it's through Medicaid. And the certification itself is structured to work in tandem with CCS. We're hoping to see in the future an expansion of that to find funding streams and billable opportunities outside of just CCS, but we're not quite there yet. In addition, before we move on, I want to really name that the certified peer specialist in Wisconsin is a professional role, but peer support is much broader than just the certified peer specialist. Peer support exists between virtually everyone, and it really is centered on building human connections, empathetic connections through shared lived experiences, centering on different aspects of identity, different experiences, not just mental health and substance use. The certification is tied to those two things, but peer support can be provided outside of the system without the certification in many informal settings and in other spaces.
Does any of the other panelists want to chime in about what is a certified peer specialist, or would we like to pass? All right, we will go to Carmella. Carmella, we're just digging right in. How can peer support be used to address racism?
Yes, the big boy there. How? And to be true to it and true to me and true to racism, it can't. It can't alone, because it lives in the constructs of what are racist, patriarchal, capitalist systems, right? So it alone will not, in the context of what Tim talked about at first, which is Wisconsin Certified Peer Specialist, because it lives within that system, the behavioral health system. Peer support, yes, outside of the constructs like Tim addressed, there are abilities to be able to do that. What certified peer specialists and what peer work can do is give voice and professionalism to those who have been impacted by racism, bias, microaggressions. And how it does that is only by having people who will identify, be able to talk about it, understand it within themselves, not have to have diagnosis like Tim said, with lived experience. And Tara brought this up. While you identify with mental health or substance use, there significant trauma, right, is going to play a big part in that. The way it does that through some tools is engage in anti-racist work. Some of the biggest tools it uses in that anti-racist work comes from the top. And this is in no way to embarrass Tim, but systems like this only work when people higher in the system allow it to work, right? So if within that system, I wanted to be a system disruptor, I in my world might be able to get farther. But if my system, as I move up, isn't allowing me to disrupt and change this behavior that I am seeing, it kind of dies with my voice. We have supervisors who believe in our voice. When there is an issue in how something is being handled, we are believed. It's not, oh, well, could you have misinterpreted that? No. And if you're not believed in something that happens, then you start to assimilate to your system because the fight gets tiring and either you walk away, maybe from a career, or you become assimilated in it. How we do this is through training. Like Tim talked about, there's the 48-hour training that we do. Anyone is considered a certified peer specialist, is trained in all of the areas he talked about around communication and that. But there's another area that is one of my favorite, which I believe sets certified peer specialists apart because we really dig into it around empathy. When I think of undoing racism, empathy to me is one of the strongest ones to do that because it says, I don't understand what you're going through, but I believe you that you're going through it. And I don't even know what to say about what you're going through, but I will be here with you while you're going through this. And I believe you. And tapping into that place, it allows the other person to tap into a place that says, I might have been through something kind of similar, and finding that peace amongst people to be able to have connection, because connection is what is going to be our biggest way of changing system beliefs. My second favorite is what I say often on the first day of when I'm training is it allows you to take yourself off the hook with being a helper. You can't help me. Nobody in this room can help me. I can only help me. And when I say that, I say that in every context of the world, I am the expert in my life. And if I want to live in a box under a bridge, because that's where my life says that I want to be at, I don't need you to tell me that I don't. right? That those little basic things, if you think about them, become the macro things in systems that tell us that people are wrong in their beliefs. It's why I really believe in those two. And peer support says, I will walk with you wherever you are, because you are the expert in your life. One of the things that I see around like system disruptors, you'll hear us use that word probably a lot today. This kind of goes back to what Tim had said, and what all of us will say today is that you can only be a system disruptor if you are in a safe place to disrupt, and if the hierarchy believes in the disruption. So you have to be able to surround yourself. If I think of 2 careers for me that have caused most harm, it has been around the many strains of social work, and it has been around policing. Those 2, because of the systems they live in, not the people that go to it, not the young police officer who wants to go be a police officer, young man who wants to go be a police officer and says, I am going to make change, and quickly finds out that the system isn't going to allow him to. M. Adams, who does Freedom Inc., and I use this all the time, describes it as, it's not the bad apples, right? It's the bag that holds the apples that's acidic. And we're allowed to be system disruptors because our system, as we move up, believes in seeing the change that we are. So if you think of racism, and it's always the discussion when I'm doing trainings around it, you can get people to believe in, everybody needs to believe me when I think of my mental health struggles. Everybody needs to believe me when I'm going through my own recovery. But you start talking about racism and the disconnect often happens. And I have to go back to those beginning things, thinking about empathy and aggressions and bias. So you have to be able to go and dig in order for the peer support. You can be the best peer support specialist, you can be the best social worker, and you can be the best police officer. But if you aren't willing to go to your boss and go to the people above you and say, this is not who I am, and this is not what I will do, then you are just perpetuating the system, which we know is racist, patriarchal, capitalist. And we once again are back to having a question be asked in another 100 years of how a system can be disrupted and how do we get rid of racism. It will take us to be the system disruptors as peer support specialists, as social workers, as many other careers, and say no more. Thanks.
Thank you, Carmella. That was amazing.
I wanted to comment really quick, if that's okay, Alicia, just to second what Carmella said about systems. And I think I don't want anyone to think that coming into this as the person who manages the certification programs and does a lot of different pieces, that we are not part of that system. We definitely are. You know, there's no way to extricate my work or the initiative from the greater behavioral healthcare system that is racist, that is oppressive, that is causing harm. And so until we can either extricate ourselves from that system or the system itself collapses and is rebuilt, we are going to be in a space where we're continuing to perpetuate harm, even when we're taking steps to mitigate some of that. And so I do want to name that as well, that, you know, Carmella had said, like, I don't want to embarrass you, but please embarrass me, because you're definitely right. And I want to name that as well.
I want to add kind of to that as well. Thinking about some of my experiences, the first thing that came to mind while Carmella was talking about this was the decision to integrate peer support into your program, right? So if you're in a basic, like a regular clinical structured therapist, social workers, case managers type of outpatient situation, if you decide that you want to integrate peer support and you realize what that is, you're already placing a value on lived experience. So for me, that's one way that peer support is just right away. You're already saying, we acknowledge that lived experience has value in this work. The next thing I was thinking about is, and that's for any system, because peer support, we'll get to this kind of in next questions, but peer support is being implemented in a lot of different ways outside of just mental health and substance use recovery systems. Then two statements came to mind, two quotes that I've experienced. So one, as a peer support specialist working with a peer, our first intake session where we're really just getting to know each other. And I start that out often by explaining what a peer support specialist is and who I am in that space as a peer support specialist. And I had a young Black woman tell me, I just got to chill. It's like the first time I could take my mask off. And what she meant by that is that when she shows up to the social worker, she has to think, what can she share and what can't she share? Who can she be in this space to get help and get support without judgment, without potentially CPS, without all these different systems that these punitive things that can happen, right? Who can I, and that's not to say that I'm not in some spaces a mandated reporter. While being a peer support specialist doesn't dictate that, being in an agency can, but there's a way that I can hear what's being said and not jump to this conclusion because I've been in that space. I think that a lot of you are probably familiar with what I mean. And then outside of that, recently, Carmella and myself and another young lady, Dominique Christian, did a presentation on culture, power, and privilege to the peer support initiative. So Tim brought us on to talk about that from a Black female perspective. And one of the feedback comments that we got after that was, this is one of the first times that somebody was able to listen to our lived experience as it had to do with racism and how we experience it on a daily basis in every space as Black women without politics. And what they meant was they didn't have to listen to whether or not Black Lives Matter was adverse to All Lives Matter, was directly at odds with Blue Lives Matter, with whatever other slogan, mantra, or political belief. They got to sit there and hear us as individuals telling the truth about how we went through life and what we experienced in a space that lived experience is valued and automatically trusted, right? So me showing up as an expert in my life as a peer in a space full of peers who have acknowledged and lived by that meant that they were able to just hear us. And some of our messages about overall systems of racism as they show up for us were able to be digested in a way that they weren't because they were able to connect to us as individuals. And then we were able to share and be in a vulnerable space. And those were two things that really sat out to me as ways, right? Is this first acknowledging that there's value in lived experience, and then listening to that value as truth, listening to those voices as truth, and separating it out from, am I guilty of this? Why did this happen? How did this happen? Just hearing that. And so for me as a peer support specialist supporting peers, another thing that I can do is stand in that gap. So when I'm in interdisciplinary teams and I'm there advocating alongside my peer, which is a very different role than a case manager, a social worker, or anyone else who is looking at this as a case, at deficits and goals to reach to get to recovery, I'm here at no matter what part of recovery my peer is in, right? I'm here to advocate just as hard in their low as I am in their high. And so when I stand in that space, and because I've been in that space enough times as a professional, there's things that I can talk to the team about and can share my lived experience from that space of as a colleague and somebody who's trusted and has a proven track record that might not happen automatically when my team is encountering my peer, right? When the team is talking to the peer about their experience, some of those narratives that come up about being non-compliant, somebody who's difficult to deal with, somebody who has relapsed many times and you don't really believe all of these different negative narratives that can come up in those spaces. Or sometimes there's meant to be positive narratives, right? This idea that we're resilient and we attach a resilience to races that don't always, right? Racial identities. Black women are seen as very strong, and it's hard to be a strong Black woman and reach out for help and receive those services when you outpour your struggles. And you're like, the first comment is, I really appreciate, or I'm really in awe of how strong you are. Things like that. So stand in that space and be able to identify with the peer and also speak the language and have the understanding and the colleague, right, that camaraderie with the team, that when I speak up and I say things, while it shouldn't be the case, right, as a peer support specialist and as an individual in recovery, I believe we should all take that statement, whatever statement the peer is making, and hold value and truth in it. But we know that that's not necessarily how it always happens. So my extra layer of protection as a peer in that system is to really double stamp it, is what I'm going to say, right? So if my peer has said this and the team is digesting it in a different way, part of how I can affect change in that system, just in that small space with those 4 or 5 individuals, is to say, well, my experience was similar, or many of the peers I've worked with have had a similar experience, or this language might not be the best way to present this, or can we reframe the way we're talking about our peer who's being difficult to somebody who's tenacious. All of those things that are really part of the foundation of what I'm learning and training, what I'm studying to do in my continued education, and what I believe and uphold as a peer support specialist.
I'll just jump off of what Tara said. I think it's so important, just the kind of ripple effect of the value of having a certified peer specialist on a team, because it goes beyond that peer-to-peer relationship. I mean, what you're talking about is that systems change, is the alignment of the values. And I think in social work a lot, we talk about like the person being the expert. And I think like peer support just like it speaks that so loud, so clearly, so loudly, and can really kind of help lift up a whole team of recognizing there are different roles that we all play. There's different spaces we all kind of live in, and having certified peer specialists being a part of that, and being a part of that in a way that's not tokenized, that's not individualized, that is like meaningful, intentional, can really shift a culture of a whole organization and a system. And I do feel like that can continue to grow, and kind of like to speak of Carmella's example, like it can shift a bag, we can create a new bag. I feel very strongly about that.
Thank you, Dani, Tara, Carmella, and Tim. Any other thoughts that anyone would like to say around the how can peer support be used to address racism? Otherwise, we can move to the next question, which I know this particular question could go on for 3 hours in itself, but I'm gonna move into how is peer support living outside the system? And I'm gonna give that to Tara.
All right, thank you. Well, so I'm going to just lay a little bit of foundation that the peer support workforce has grown over the last years to over 10,000 specialists throughout 50 states in the nation, and it's also an international, right? Here in Wisconsin, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say the number's at about 1,400 in the workforce trained. So even though there's those type of numbers, we still see few inroads into the private sector and into primary care, behavioral health, and primary care. The primary reason goes back to what Tim said about where the reimbursement lies right now. So peer support in Wisconsin was created to be part of the Medicaid system. And so reimbursement lies within Medicaid. And so the way that we can, for me, that I've been exploring just doing that outside of the system, which is still in the system, but outside of that specific Medicaid system, is appealing to some of the folks in the area who have the power to put peer support into the budget, right? We forget that insurance reimbursement isn't the only place that money comes from. Foundations are putting money out here into RFPs and grants every year on a cycle. So we appeal to a group of us have started doing proposals and having meetings and leveraging our social capital and our relationships throughout the community to get into spaces and have talks to talk about what is peer support, how can peer support show up and support folks in your entity, and whether that's at the hospitals, whether that is in a corporation, whether that is through nonprofit work, those are spaces. And so this last year, in response to the United Way of Dane County's emergency COVID response, I was part of an organization of Black, called the Dane County Collaboration of Black Service Providers. And that was an collaboration of over 13 Black-run organizations that primarily focus on serving the Black community here in Madison and throughout Dane County. And my focus and my contribution to that was that I provided warm line peer support. So really identifying, this is something I've talked about in many spaces. If you've heard me talk about it before, here I go again. There's a difference between case management and peer support. Case management is resources, right? Case management is identifying what the issue is and helping someone get to the resources and get through them. A peer support specialist is somebody who might show up in that space and support that, right? So if I show up with my case manager and I walk out with a list of things that I need to get taken care of based on deficits that were identified in a long assessment. Okay, I'm gonna breathe for a second because that was a lot. So the deficit based. If I walk out of that office, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling overwhelmed with the tasks. Even if it's a great relationship, a great meeting, who do I turn to with the part of the social emotional piece that I need this support, that I need to take these steps to do this, to get to this support, all of these other pieces, that would be the peer support specialist role, right? That's where I differ. So I'm here to help you navigate. I'm here to share my experience with those resources. Maybe I have ideas about loopholes or things that made it easier for me when I had to navigate those resources. But I'm not here to give you a list of things to do. So instead of just being a case manager that shuffled the papers, right? I took in the application, I processed it, I got the check out to your landlord or whatever the resource help was. What I did is when there was a referral for resources in more than one organization, they were referred to me and we had a conversation about how are things going and how can you get support. And the things that come out of that are like the root cause story, right? Those are the things that while it helped for you to pay my rent today, me and the peers were able to get to a place that we talked about, how did we get there? What can we do preventively? How are you feeling about being in that situation? And honestly, it feels great to get your bill paid, right? When you're behind on the rent, heck yeah, I want that rent check in there because that's a load off my mind. But does it change my struggle for next month? Does it change the way I felt about not being able to pay those bills? No, it doesn't. And so I use that often because I know two things. One, we tend to think of case management in that space and people get confused. What's the difference between a case manager and a peer support specialist? And I like to emphasize that a lot. So that's one way, right? Is us utilizing our budgets. So think about somebody who's a department head, a program head, somebody who's writing a grant. Think about how can you utilize that extra piece of support that would be the social emotional piece versus just administrative. When you're thinking about when you apply for grant funds, when you're making budgets for departments and new programs. An example of this is that some of our hospitals have made partnerships with a couple different community organizations that have utilized peer support. UW Health previously had a arrangement with Focus Interruption when they still provided peer support, that we would show up when families who were involved in shootings were there. And our space there, our role there was to do that, to provide socially emotional support to people who either witnessed or were involved on either side of that incident, with the goal not just to help those folks in that time, but also to try to end any retaliatory behavior. So it was very specific, and UW invested in that. And currently, I know that is it UW as well that's partnering with Safe Communities? Somebody in here nod for me. But another organization is partnering with another hospital is partnering with the organization around overdose and substance use, and that's utilizing peer support. And that's being done outside of a Medicaid model. And there's more and more ways that we can continue to grow that and think about how we utilize that. So that's one way. And then another way is within the peer movement. And so Alicia talked about how we co-facilitate the Dane County Peer Support Network. And while the name would make you think that it's really just focused on our region, we are open right now to peers throughout Wisconsin. And this leads to how we organize outside of that. So we have a quarterly advocacy meeting, which means that we spend that time once every 3 months talking about how do we really take to the street or to the Zoom and take action. And part of that is preparing peers to do that, because just because I have a lived experience with mental health, substance use, trauma, doesn't mean that I necessarily am prepared for civic engagement or advocacy. And so we've been inviting people who have know-how or who are in the system to come to our meetings and, one, talk to us about what that means. 2, give us resources, websites, ways to dig in. And then 3, we're building that relationship, right? We're introducing ourselves to them to us, and we're asking them to continue that relationship. When there's things that they think would be relevant to this group, to email us and let us know so that we can take action or be more educated on that. And vice versa. We had the invitation come back from them that when there's things happening or we see legislature that's coming up that we have a deep interest in, that we now have somebody to reach out to talk to. And so we plan on continuing to do that. Through the network, one of our hopes is that we can grow that and support networks similarly happening throughout Wisconsin and other regions, which is why we have Dane County open to everyone in Wisconsin. And so it's a space for us to learn and do those things together and to take the next steps to practice and do that. Within that same network, part of our minutes, we invite peers who are part of that network to share with us calls to action or information and resources. And so that goes out as part of our minutes. And so constantly working to educate, support, and then realize that the strength is in numbers and the power is there. Me and Tim were recently having a conversation because one of my things really right now is thinking about how do we get this reimbursement outside of Medicaid? And within that conversation, it came up that there was a stopping point. And, you know, my question was, well, who's above that stopping point? Who do we go to that next space? And so those challenges and those thoughts, and then taking that information back to the network, mobilizing it, really lives in that same framework of organizing, right? Community organizing, but from this specific lens of folks with lived experience that are also standing in that gap between lived experience and the professional support system. So for me, those are our real key ways. And I want to invite my other panelists to join and add anything. I'm sure I can think of some other stuff, but those are the main points I wanted to share real quick and invite you guys to add on.
There are two other spaces that I can think of that I think are really, really important to mention. And one of them is still a system, but I do think it's important to name that we do have certified peer specialists working within the Department of Corrections in all of our maximum security institutions, as well as the majority of medium and some minimum. The Department of Corrections has been extremely invested in bringing peer support and CPS into their systems. So they host trainings for people who are incarcerated, and then those people who are incarcerated will take the same training that we take in the community. They take the same exam, they get certified, and then they work as certified peer specialists, providing peer support to other people who are incarcerated. And to see that type of a peer model adopted into that system, I think is a huge change that I personally was not anticipating being involved in. And so they've been very on board with maintaining the integrity of the program, with maintaining the integrity of the services being provided to the best of their ability within the confines of institutions and different systems. And we actually, in December, were able to train 2 CPS who are incarcerated as state certified trainers so that they can continue doing trainings. And that advancement was really, really exciting. I think when we also look outside of systems, I cannot let the opportunity to talk about Trans Lifeline go past me without talking about them. They are nationwide, and actually they offer services in Canada and Mexico as well. Crisis services line that is peer support for trans people by trans people. That is the requirement to be a part of there and to access services is to be trans. And they are accredited as a crisis line. They provide services across the country as well as distribute microgrants. But the peer support they're providing is centered around that experience of transness and not mental health or substance use and not the crisis that that person's calling about. It's centered on their experience with the trans identity. And what's really cool about Trans Lifeline is that they refuse to participate in non-consensual active rescue. So they will not call the police or emergency services on you at any time unless you've explicitly said that you want them called. And I name that because they're operating using funding from a variety of different sources, microgrants, from donations from XYZ place. They're nationally accredited and recognized as a crisis line, and they're able to implement that policy. And it's important to know about these places and organizations that are doing these things, because that's usually one of the biggest pushbacks when we talk about moving outside the system or big systems changes, that the system will say, well, that's not possible to have a crisis response or crisis policy that's like that, where we never call law enforcement. That's not possible to do. And to be able to point at this very well recognized and respected within the peer community and behavioral healthcare system crisis line that is doing that successfully is really, really critical.
Thank you, Tim and Tara. Dani or Carmella, any thoughts around this question that you'd like to add?
I had something, but I think I can wait for after Dani because I have something I can wrap it up with.
All right. And I just want to chime in on living outside the system and how peer support can. I just very much view it, working at Chrysalis with Dani, that we have done that within our agency. We are doing that within our agency, like talking about peer support and sharing our lived experience to each other, to staff. I want to just call out having a peer specialist on staff, I think was already said, but having a peer specialist on staff, and we have half of our staff about our certified peer specialists, that in itself can really create peer support outside of that system, and really talk about wellness in a way that's like a human to human experience, not necessarily a like you have a diagnosis or you have this struggle, therefore we talk about wellness. Like, no, it's a human experience. So I'm going to go to our next question, which is, how do peer specialists hold systems accountable to anti-racism? And that one will go over to Tim.
Yeah, so I think, again, to go back to even that initial response that Carmella gave, it was like, individually, we can't. There's no way to hold an entire system accountable just through one profession. And I want to name again and make it very clear that when I'm talking about systems, behavioral healthcare systems, when I talk about these big things, we're talking about the system and not the individual people within them, right? Those are two separate things. And I want to make that very, very clear. Because in my past of holding systems accountable, that apparently hasn't always been clear. But when we look at how do certified peer specialists hold systems accountable, it's by being present and being willing to be a systems disruptor. And so it's naming when these systems are not following their own rules, which happens very regularly when we're being treated differently than other professionals. And when we can see when we can see racist policies or procedures within the agencies that we work at, within the response that we're providing to people experiencing big emotions or heightened states, being willing to name those things with our supervisors, with our organizations, and then taking it a step further and saying, okay, we've named this, you've come to the table, whether or not you're actually willing to agree that this is the case, if you feel like this isn't racist, but it actually is, that's a different kind of conversation. But taking it that step further of just like being aware of these things and knowing that they're going on, and moving into that action step of, okay, we've identified this, that there's racism taking place in this system, both on an individual level with the people receiving services and at the macro scale of the way that policies are designed, the way that funding is distributed, the way that things become evidence-based. And now what do we do about it? And so when we look at like, how do we change policies within organizations, it's going to your supervisor consistently, over and over again, reminding them like, hey, I still want to see this changed. Hey, here's what we could be doing. Can we talk about this further? What are our options here? And it's also knowing when doing it by yourself isn't necessarily going to be as effective as possible. One of the pieces of my role that I like the most is that we get to provide a lot of technical assistance. So when certified peer specialists who may be working alone in an organization say like, hey, there's this thing that's happening in my workplace that is out of line with peer values or is racist or whatever, and I want help calling attention to this and affecting change, they can reach out to me, and then we get to go in and not only provide support in a way that like, I'm here with you in this conversation, but also making it clear that it's not just me as an individual, it's me representing this initiative. And the initiative feels that there's no place for racism in the peer workforce. There's no place for white supremacy in the peer workforce. And we want to do something about it by showing up in these workspaces at these tables where policies are being written. And also from a more macro scale, when we look at our funders and the different committees that I sit on and work groups that I'm in, it's being able to show up there and represent the initiative and the workforce in a way that's beholden to them. And that I think is one of the most important pieces, is that every certified peer specialist in the state is entitled to have a voice in the direction of this program. And we really look to them to direct us as to what they want to see us doing. So when we come to this table to say, we want to hold this system accountable for anti-racist policies or anti-racist funding practices, and we want to do something about it, and here's a solution we can put forward. I won't say never, but I would say 95% of the time, it's not just me coming to the table saying, this is what I want to see. It's me coming to the table saying, this is what the training participants are saying. This is what the trainers want to see. This is what the employers are saying to me. This is what the people trying to sign up for this class are saying that they want to see. And being able to have the backing of the workforce. And to me, I know this is going to sound a little like preposterous or a little big-headed, but I really look at it as like, there's a mandate from the workforce of what they want to see us do, and it's hold these systems accountable. And so it's continually showing up. And I think one of the ways for me that's shown up the most is is being willing to kind of take the heat from these systems that don't want to change. And so it's been working with the trainers to hear, what do you guys want to see? And what do you want to do? And then saying, okay, go do it. And then when the system comes back and says, like, we're really mad that you told them that they could do this, or we didn't like this training that you put forward, being willing to say, you know, that was my decision. And, you know, you can be upset with me, but not the trainers. It's on us. It's on us as a program. And not in a weird, like, I'm a martyr for them all kind of way, but in a way that, like, there needs to be a person that can take that seat and take that heat so that the employment can grow and flourish. So we see it in a lot of different ways, but to me, it's really like showing up, naming what's going on, coming forward with solutions, knowing when to engage in like greater peer communities for support, and then learning how to advocate at larger levels. I really appreciate what Tara talked about, that just because you're a certified peer specialist or you have lived experience, it doesn't, that skill set doesn't necessarily equate activism or advocacy skill set or civic engagement skill set. And so going through those trainings of like, how do I get onto a committee or a board? And not just how do I get onto it, but how do I participate? What are the rules? How do I navigate through them? Because we do have to unfortunately play within the confines of the system to change the system. And I think one of the last pieces that I want to talk about is, when we talk about holding systems accountable, it's also knowing when to withdraw from those systems, when to say, okay, you know, we've talked about this, you said you're going to do this and you're not doing it, or you haven't said you're going to do anything, and so nothing's changing. We're going to go. We're not going to continue to participate in a partnership that isn't mutually beneficial or respectful. We're not going to continue to, you know, provide training or funding or whatever it may be to groups that aren't willing to hold these values. We are going to really set boundaries around what are the principles of these different programs, what are the principles that we're putting forward, and how do we maintain them with integrity. And so a large part for me is also knowing when to get up from the table and say, I need to be putting my energy into other spaces.
All right. So Carmella said she didn't want to embarrass you for one reason, and I'm going to go the opposite because I'm about to rain some compliments your direction. So, um, I mentioned that when I came into the training, I quickly found how to communicate with Tim as the program director. It wasn't that I knew Tim as a person, that's grown since then. It was that I came into this training and I quickly saw a space that, like many other systems, needed diversity, that we needed to match the clientele to the provider kind of a thing, right? Well, in a peer world, that's not how we refer to it, right? It's peer to peer. But to translate to a social work kind of a thought, thinking about how do we better match the demographic. And so my squeaky wheel was well oiled. I came to Tim in the initiative and I voiced my opinions, my concerns. I was asked questions about what would I like to see different? How could I get involved? So it wasn't just me complaining and him taking the onus. There was peer support happening right there between the two of us, where him not saying, I'm gonna fix this for you, Tara, I agree, but what can you do? What do you want to do? And when I submitted ideas, suggestions, we talked about those, and that's parlayed into the initiative contracting with me, a Black woman entrepreneur in my organization that's seeking to diversify the workforce. And so what I'm doing now within the initiative statewide is providing outreach, providing support through training, exams, and networking and skill development workshops to specifically Black and BIPOC community members. So other peers in the community who are interested in becoming peer support specialists, or who have already done the training and are looking for some more support. So what I say that is not just to say how dope Tim is, because he is, but to talk about how systems can really make change. Even if you're not he's not the top dog, right? He's the program director. He's not the end all be all in peer support, but he does have a position. He does have a voice. He does have a seat at the table. And when I came to him as part of the workforce and I said what I had to say about diversity, he found value. He dug into that. He valued me. He supported me, and he took my voice and carried it to the next space. And together we're now partnering with others in the community community and in the workforce to make that change, to drive that change. And so to me, that cues into each one of our own ability, right? It was my ability to identify the issue and to speak up and advocate for myself and my community. And then it was Tim's responsibility to hear me and to do the same and to utilize his position. And it's just continually doing that. So for me, that's one of the other spaces is becoming a peer support specialist and going into a peer model and aligning yourself with the codes and the values of peer support demand that I sit and I listen to that experience, right? And that I sit with you in how can we work through that, and we brainstorm and I support that. And so him doing that in a professional way, and then empowering me to do the same means that 2 years ago, I sat with a peer who I constantly praised for her advocacy, her ability to self-advocate and run through resources. We talked about resiliency, not in a generic way, but we really talked about spaces and times that I saw her thriving in difficult, traumatic times and showing her resilience. And I'm proud to say that this year right now, this same person is being trained to be a parent peer support specialist, which is another kind of tier to this work. It's another credential that specifies lived experience in supporting a child with mental health or substance use, right? And that's not to say that I created this, right? No, but through my position and the support from Tim, I'm now able to help her to realize that same vision. And then the people that she's going to be able to help from that role, and the other person that she's going to be able to inspire. That same conversation that her and I had about how she really was a self-advocate and she was powerful and how her story could impact another, right? She's going to tell that same story when she's done with the credential. When she's out here doing the work, she's going to have a similar conversation with someone. And because we're both Black women, the likelihood is that's going to be another Black or BIPOC person. And that adds to more of us in the profession that have lived experiences that are similar, right? That we're coming from same spaces. It also puts us at a table where we can constantly point out, and from a space of love. You know, when I'm in trainings with primarily white folks and we start talking about issues and some of those old things come out about, you know, here's a typical one. My Black child is in school and the teacher thinks they're being aggressive, and I'm telling them that no, my child is just passionate, right? This whole conversation about Black people being louder or more impassioned. My pushback is, okay, yeah, that was all right at a surface level for that first piece of bringing out the cultural differences and being culturally responsive and pointing out some potential bias, right? But really, I want to challenge everybody in this space to think about how white supremacy is showing up. How is white supremacy showing up that made you believe that that made you believe that you couldn't recognize a child being passionate versus a child being aggressive? Right? How did you get to adulthood? How did you get through your first relationships in the community? How did you get through a college education, sometimes a master's degree education, and it never occurred to you to be able to recognize, I saw this one Black child act this way, I see this other Black child act this way, and this is what it is. And so while that might not be my peer support specialist that, you know, that spoke out and said that might just be the little advocate that's always lived in me. My role as a peer support specialist trainer, my role as a peer support specialist, I at a table allowed me to say that to key individuals, allowed me to talk to those folks and hopefully to leave them with something to think about when they walked away. And so what I really value here is the fact that part of our mandate is to be system interrupters, right? To be advocates. I don't know that that shows up in any other profession, but I'm very proud to be in a profession that states that. When I come through the door, there's an expectation that I am to stand in a space of systems accountability and interruption. That when I see these injustices, it's my job to speak up and advocate and to empower other folks to do the same. And I don't know what other role, professional role is out there that lists that. So I wanted to give Tim his kudos for really being a man that stood in that space and did that and listened to what I and others said and continues to fight that fight, to the initiative for taking that stance and doing work to anti-racist work within our workforce. And then also just as a peer support specialist to say that when we're at the table, we have to use our voice, and being part of this network, this group, and having those types of support for my lived experience empowered me to do that.
Thank you, Tara. I'm just going to do a time check. We're a little over an hour. So I'm going to move to the last question, which is, what do we do now? Like, where do we go from here? How can we support anti-racist work? And I'm going to shift that over to Dani.
And I will say, I think probably everyone will have something to add as well to this, but I'll just share my piece. I think a lot of things have already been said about how we can all be systems disruptors. And I would say I feel like social work does fit. It at its core fits into that. I mean, and I think we should all social workers listening and other folks in the community, I think just as members of a community, we should always be questioning why we're doing things and how we can do them better in a more inclusive way. And I think that leads a little bit into a question I would pose, or just, I guess it's not as much a question. First, I just want to give us permission to think about things differently without jumping straight to like the barriers. Because I think a lot of times in our work, we might have oh, this would be wonderful, but X, Y, and Z are what's going to get in the way, or there's this funding barrier. And I think there's so much merit and value in just like letting yourself dream a little bit about what can be and envision into what it could look like, and start to think about steps. And kind of in parallel to that, I also want to just do like a check-in, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in this space, but I would encourage everybody, especially people who haven't worked alongside certified peer specialists, didn't even know what a certified peer specialist was before this, to kind of sit with like what you're hearing and what you're feeling. So, I feel like from my perspective, I could see like thoughts of excitement. There might be feelings of feeling attacked too, or curious. And I think all of those are very welcome, and just encouraged to feel and recognize like there are spaces to talk through that and value and feeling them and processing them. And then like taking steps to recognize how this might show up in the organizations you're in now, or how it's not showing up, and where your kind of social capital is to make some changes, to take some steps, to explore why there might not be anyone with lived experience in your work field, and what it could look like if there were people in that setting, and how you could support that. And again, like I think it's been said in this space, is it's really valuable not to do it alone, is to find community, align with others who have that same belief. And I think there's so much ability to make real change in your small community, larger community, if you have that network. I'm gonna look real quick at my notes. And I will just put a plug in, and then I want to open it up for others. So Alicia, Tara, and I have been working for a little over a year now on something we're calling the Certified Peer Specialist Learning Community. And it is still morphing, but what we are all passionate, I'd say everyone on this call, but something we're working on specifically is how we can support more behavioral health communities and potentially beyond to incorporate certified peer specialists in a meaningful way, to increase employment opportunities, to provide support, and just look at, what that looks like in your organization. So right now, they mentioned there's a Certified Peer Specialist Network, which is a monthly group that meets together, open for peer specialists and those interested in that. They also host or co-facilitate a peer specialist supervisors bi-monthly meeting. And then we're looking at ways to get more involved with organizations, with behavioral health agencies or other settings interested in incorporating certified peer specialists. So I believe at the end, there will be a survey that's shared that if you're interested in learning more about that work, or being part of it, or seeing how that could fit into your own organization, I encourage you to add your name and your email, and we're working on a newsletter to share information. So that was just my plug, and I want to give some space for others to share too.
Yeah, thank you, Dani. It looks like we definitely have time. So anyone else, take your time answering this question.
I actually wanted to, kind of based off of the other three questions that were asked, I think it is really important when we think of systems too, to realize that because of the macro and big system, that all of us are part of the system. So if you think of like someone who just gets hired on, less likely to be as involved in it. But so for instance, like with myself, with my day job, I am a supervisor in an agency that is a has peer support specialists, but also has case managers. It's called Just Dane. It's a social justice agency. And because of my supervisory role, when I'm running this program and I'm starting to think of part of our initiative of Just Bakery is we hire our students and then to run our bakery and sell the products that support the program. there was a time when I, as a supervisor, would run into things that would, in my old culinary of working in the system, even in culinary, of, wait, this is what you do and you don't do when you're coming to work, and you don't come to work, and you don't show up on time, and you don't do this. And found myself living within the system of what people designed a workplace to be like. And I went to my executive director, and she said something to me, and this was about 6 years ago. Oh, so you want everybody else to hire them, but you can't work with them? And it was like, boom, bang in my head. And I have now designed Just Bakery to be a place of peer. There's not anyone who would go through anything that I wouldn't offer services of support to keep them on. It's not, oh, you're fired. It's, what do you need from me to be able to be successful in this career? And I do that with my teachers, with my instructors. We have designed it to be a just workplace around making sure everybody is a peer model. There isn't I want to be I am their leader. I don't want to be their supervisor. I have a supervisor. We only need one in an agency. I want to be their leader in guiding them on how to do this and guiding them. But just because now they're working from me and not a student any longer, why would I change how I treat them? And so it's been an educational process. And I bring this up because when you go to work in any kind of career, and for most of those that are in the room around social work, remember that you can perpetuate the system by just not, by causing harm to those that are your subordinates, those that are under you. So that's one thing. In our agency, some of the things we did was we took away degrees for those that we work with. Do you have one? Yes, it's great. We love if you do have one, but it doesn't stop you from being hired to work with people who have been formerly incarcerated, justice involved, who have been, who struggle with mental health. Those aren't the major qualifications. We wanted to make sure our minimum wage was $15 an hour. We brought in Alicia and Tim to train us when we brought in peer support, so that we did it in a way that was just to all of our peer supports. Then we made sure the coordinator, we had a coordinator of peer supports, were educated in peer support, was a peer support specialist themselves. And so when you think of all these pieces that you can then do as being a system disruptor, the last piece I want to say, and I say this, I've been invited to speak to a lot of social work classes. And when the day comes, hopefully it doesn't, when and or if the day comes that you have 5 files in front of you and they don't all look different, but they all look the same because you're seeing them as names on a piece of paper, and you're seeing them not as each individual human beings and each individual circumstances and each individual people and trauma and struggles. When you start identifying them as a file that you put to the side and you complete, quit your job, because you are no longer doing no harm. That's what I wanted to say.
I think in terms of next steps, and I want to touch on some of the pieces that I see in the Q&A as well, but what's really important, I think, is to recognize, like, what am I capable of, and what do I have the ability to, where do I have the ability to affect change? I think Dani touched on this a little bit as well, with like, what kind of social capital do I have, and where can I invest in different spaces? But we're talking about kind of more macro systems level change. And I think it's important to understand kind of like, when I talk about different things that I do, or when Tara's talking about us launching these programs together and doing these things, I'm only able to do that because of the position I'm in and the scope that comes with it. And so it's, I think a big part is understanding too, like, if you're the only certified peer specialist at an agency and you're very much kind of in a minority position, understanding that when we're talking about systems disruption, it doesn't have to be you kind of doing this enormous project or something. It can be changing the language that's being used to talk about people. It can be working towards a well workplace, so adjusting how supervision looks. It can be a variety of kind of smaller things, and I don't want to make it seem like that means they're less important, but it doesn't always have to be a huge, endeavor that you're taking on to affect change. There's lots of different ways that we can affect change in a variety of different aspects. And so I think understanding and holding on to that too, that affecting change in a smaller orbit is no less impactful and no less meaningful than coming to the table to affect change at a systems level. And if I'm being honest, from my experiences at least, I usually have more success on a more individual, smaller scale level than I do trying to change an entire system, which isn't to say it's not possible, but sometimes you see quicker, more meaningful results that way. And so when it comes to moving forward, I think we as a workforce need to kind of, I don't think this is a word, but collectivize a little bit better. The voices are a little disparate right now when it comes to like, what do CPS want to see? I tend to speak to a lot of people, but we don't see a ton of organizing in like regional centers of states or like a whole statewide like association that's able to come to the table. And so seeing more of those pieces come forward and really be able to hold systems accountable and push them forward, I think would be really important, as well as continuing as a workforce to educate ourselves, not just on anti-racist work, but the way that the behavioral healthcare system and the work of certified peer specialists intersects with all of the other systems in society. And really leveraging that to affect change, not just in the behavioral healthcare system, but also in the educational system, in the quote unquote criminal justice system, in the housing systems, and recognizing that those things play a role in creating these mental health and substance use challenges, right? If you've experienced incarceration, that has an impact on your mental well-being. If you're experiencing homelessness, food insecurity, economic insecurity, all of those things have an impact on your well-being. And by working to address those disparities and potentially making sure everybody has stable housing or basic income, you can alleviate a lot of mental health and substance use challenges. And understanding that as certified peer specialists, we are able to go into those arenas to advocate and use our voices to affect change through our profession and our mandate of being systems disruptors, that those things are within the realm of where we need to be speaking up and engaging as well as the behavioral healthcare system. And so really changing the way that we're looking at systems change from, I want to just change the mental health and substance use service system because that's the one I work in, to I want to affect change across all of these intersecting ways in ways that elevate each other and restore the humanity that's often lost when we're navigating through systems.
I think there's a really important question in here that would be best answered by you, Tim, but not to put you on the spot. But if it gets answered anyway, you'd be the one who should answer it. So what parts of the CPS curriculum that discuss racism, if you can share?
I saw it and I was like, Carmella's gonna get me with this. So the CPS curriculum addresses racism, but not as much as it needs to, right? I think it's, I'm gonna share some background information, and I don't want it to be seen as me trying to make excuses for why this isn't incorporated more effectively. The certified peer specialist training is 48 hours long. It's meant to be a entry-level training, right? It's meant to be a basic, like here is the basic skill set of how to be a certified peer specialist, what that entails. And then through continuing education, through additional trainings, you're meant to build upon that to build out your skill set and through professional development. So the training itself does touch on culture, power, and privilege. It does touch on systemic oppression, systemic racism, historical and intergenerational trauma, and a few other different areas that intersect with them. It's not necessarily done in like a deep dive into those things. And so what you're going to come out of it with is kind of a very basic understanding and some entry level information about it. And from there, we're hoping then that CPS will be able to recognize like, this was in the certification training. It's important to the profession, and I need to take this base and then build upon it. And we do that a lot of times through our communities of practice, which were mentioned earlier. We host a monthly community of practice for certified peer specialists and parent peer specialists around the state to come together and learn from each other or from a speaker. And we use that to do additional training in areas that we'd like to see built up. And to link it back to what I was talking about earlier, you know, some of our topics for this year include like supporting people experiencing visa insecurity, supporting foster and adoptive parents, alternative crisis responses. And so we are, you know, we really do look at like not just mental health and substance use, but all of these other intersecting systems. And that includes, you know, anti-racist frameworks that CPS need to be educated in.
Okay, I'm gonna go over to Sherry and we can do maybe some questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. You've done such a good job of monitoring the questions already. I was filtering through. I think we've touched a lot on, you know, this idea of macro and where we could grow, you know, looking beyond Medicaid for funding. But are there other areas for growth that you see, like in an ideal world, where do you want to see peer support going in the future, and where are they not currently that you think we could use peer support specialists?
I think Tim would be great to answer this. However, I would like to see it from out from under the health services kind of idea and have it be its own entity, which, you know, not everything means it's going to be perfect, that it's not living within a larger system. Things go wrong in small systems sometimes too. But I think that, and then I think for me, when I think of it, I think of everywhere from youth, because if you look, one of the reasons I didn't become a certified peer specialist earlier was it has been around in Wisconsin for a while, was because in my mind, I wanted to be able to have basic understanding through a curricula, because that's how I teach and that's what works best for me, skill sets that allow me to do this right so I didn't cause more harm. I didn't want to just go into doing it because I have lived experience. Had I processed my lived experience, had I dealt with my lived experience, what was I going to do to someone else if I sat down with them? And so I would love to see it grown in all the areas you can think of: mentor, mentee, peer, all of those. You think of youth, you think of like the restorative justice model. In my son's school, they are peers that mentor each other through bullying, through violence, through those. It should, the way it is designed, and if you believe in what it can be, I can't think of a place personally that it shouldn't be used as those that can walk alongside in such a different way. We keep saying, you know, no case management, no case management. We really, at least I really do when I am training, unplug people from helpers. I don't even like the word used in it when I'm training. You aren't going to help anyone. And if we really start letting people realize that they are the experts in their lives, peer support should be everywhere. Everyone should be able to have the peer model, peer version of having that person that walks alongside them. Think of it as a professional friend that allows you to share those things without the judgment that sometimes a friend can have of wanting to give you advice and tell you what to do. Trained person in being able to walk with you through life.
I want to say so Carmella's answer was the first thing that came to my mind was like everywhere, right? It should be everywhere. But I do want to name out some very specific systems. And for me, I always take a cultural, racial lens to things. And so when I think about the systems that are really, especially within our own county and state, doing a lot of the harm within my own community, which is Black and BIPOC, I think about the school system. I think about the way that we interact with parents. I think about the way that I've shown up as a peer to support a parent in an IEP meeting and watched while we walked out the door, have that peer say that went totally different than any other meetings gone because I had someone sitting next to me that they thought of as some type of authority, right? Sometimes we just need a title. We need another person. The healthcare system. I'm currently in a relationship with a peer who has an extensive history of inpatient mental health, right? So when they're at crisis, And the thing that we talk about a lot is how if some of those times when she didn't have any other resources than showing up at the emergency room, and the emergency room decided not to keep her as an inpatient and they sent her right back out the door, if she'd had a peer who understood that, who'd been there, who understood the struggle of getting support when even she realized she needed, right? She was in a proactive space and then realized the only way she was going to get the support she needed was to be in a crisis space. So that's one place, right? That space between crisis and needing to be an inpatient or residential type of space like that, an inpatient. Corrections, we're already there, but I think Carmella, you said youth, and I started shaking my head. EDO has a program called Buyout, which is Black youth and young adults. And my end goal, as I've discussed with Tim, is to support and eventually have a youth peer support certification. As a mother of multiple kiddos, and as the mom that always wanted the kids to come to the house, so I knew what my kids, who they were with and what they were doing, I'm connected to so many youth in our community. And when I talk to them and have real conversations about the gun violence, when I talk to them and have real conversations about the use and abuse of prescription pills, the stealing and the high risk behavior of stealing vehicles and high speed chases, a lot of that is a normal adolescent response to the crap that's piled on them, right? Our kids, my kids didn't get a chance to be the kids that even I was afforded, right? I was interracially adopted into a small white community, and that afforded me the ability to mess up and not become a criminal. It afforded me the ability to have supports and a community that wrapped around me. And our kids need that same thing. Our youth need that same thing. Somebody I respect in the community once said that a mentor needs to be within 3 steps from the mentee. And what he meant by that is if I'm a 15-year-old, I need to be mentored by somebody who's about 18 or 19. Same thing for a 30-year-old. I need somebody who's about 33, somebody who's been where I've been, can relate to who I am, is talking the same generational language, but has tools and connections to recovery, who's in a space that while I've been where you've been, I've also gotten to this space and I can be this beacon of hope. I can be this example for you. So those are things. So any kind of youth services, youth corrections. I think about the idea of kids who are first getting ticketed and how the power of talking to somebody who's not there to judge them, not there to penalize them, but somebody who can relate to what they've gone through. The power I've had in talking to kids about gun situations, just sharing the experience me and my son and my family have experienced because of guns. So those are places that I really think the healthcare system, being in that space of walking alongside someone. And there's places where they use it for chronic illness, right? There's such a thing as peer support in cancer and different places like that. But then we hear, I could post right now on Facebook that I had a racist experience with a hospital, and people in my community would start guessing which hospital. And because of that, that didn't happen because I was in with the doctor. That can happen when I walked into the space with the receptionist. The power of having somebody to unload that with, the power of having somebody to walk that walk with, gives me back power to face that. And while the system needs to fix itself and needs to take the onus on working on that from a systemic and an HR standpoint and a training standpoint, what I can do right now as a peer is walk in there with you, whether it's virtual or physical or what have you, right? Whether it's the phone call you make afterwards, whether it's the last call you make before you get in to say, yep, we both know it's about to be some BS, but you were there for what? Okay, right? That pep talk. Those are spaces that a peer support specialist, for me, is when we look at the most oppressive systems, those are places that people with lived experience navigating and thriving even outside of that system need to be implemented. And then I would call on legislature. I would call on all of us to think about how so many initiatives coming out right now have talked about including peer support specialists, and then the funding was dropped off at the end. So, and I'm going to call out the crisis response, right? The response right now that has the non-police emergency response. There's a person with lived experience that was talked about being part of that from the beginning and has now been left out of the budget. So we've taken the police out of crisis response, and now we've got an EMS provider, very important. We've got a behavioral health professional, also important. But having somebody who's walked in that space is also important. Having somebody to look to say, I've been here and here I am today to support you is huge. That's more powerful than any one of those other folks showing up in that space. The Behavioral Health Resource Center over on the south side of Madison is, talked about peer support and still has a goal of including a peer support specialist, but that's another space. Making sure that when the CAHOOTS model, the crisis response CAHOOTS model, is put into place, that we hold our legislatures, our policymakers accountable when they talk about adding peer support, utilizing peer support, valuing lived experience, that we hold them to that the accountability is there, and that we ask the questions about where the funding is to support that role, where the support is to support that role. And each one of you, I see in here, people talk about how can they as individuals do that? Speak up, speak out. Ask people, question people. Would somebody with lived experience have a different, ask yourself, would somebody with lived experience have a different response to this? How would I feel if this was my experience, right? Empathy is a core piece of what we do. There's no sympathy, it's empathetic compassion. So those are things that I would say. And if you mind, I want to answer one more question, because I see that it says, is there a connection between peer support and local restorative justice efforts? Personally, I am a peacemaker. I am part of the Dane County Restorative Justice program, getting ready to do a circle coming up. I encourage other peer support specialists to look at that as something that is something to add to the repertoire of places we show up. And I absolutely think that we have a role there. I think we have a role in supporting the drug court system. Any place that the system is working with people who have lived experience. We're supporting lived experience in the Homeless Services Consortium. While that's not necessarily peer support specialists, it's about peer support and lived experience. So that's my answer to that.
We are at actually a little past our time, but I just wanted to say thank you all so very much. Carmella, Tim, Tara, Dani, and Alicia, for being here today, sharing your time, expertise, and your valuable information. Thank you also to everyone in attendance for being part of our event and for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. And please watch for an email. A couple of you had asked about your CEUs. There will be an evaluation, and at the end of that, you can input information if you'd like us to email you CEU credits for today's attendance. And again, reminding everyone, we hope to see you next week, February 12th, for part 2 of the conference. And thank you again, everyone, very much.
Thanks, everyone.